Okay. Welcome back to the House Environment Committee. Just to orient members and folks who may be following, Secretary Moore and I at one of our meetings sort of were talking about the budget and questions the committee had and how to get more in depth and better understanding on our part of the work that they do to build the budget. And so we came up with what's the series of witness testimony this week, some of it directly tied to the budget and others more just timely topics of interest for the committee from the agency. And so we had to work obviously with a lot of people's schedules to make this work. So I'm glad we could. Welcome Secretary Moore and Steve Gomez.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, Steve Gomez, I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Agency of Natural Resources.
I'm Julie Warren, the Secretary of Natural Resources.
So this afternoon, going to walk through a couple different pieces of how ANR handles the budget. So I'll cover kind of the development of the budget in terms of the complete cycle. So take a 12-month snapshot and kind of what happens behind the scenes at ANR. Also highlight again our FY27 budget that we presented earlier to all of you, and then cover some of the funding sources, the major funding sources we have and how those work as part of our budget, and then also the day-to-day budget management. So as I'm going through, feel free to jump in and ask questions. I'd prefer that than having to go straight through this without a break. So please jump in. So I'll start here with, this is a really big picture overview of the state's entire budget. And I think this helps with some context here. So this slide was published by the Public Assets Institute from data provided by the Joint Fiscal Office. And basically on the left-hand column, you'll see major revenue streams for the state. And on the right-hand column, you'll see major programs for the state. And if you look on the right-hand column there, third from the bottom, natural resources and climate, that's where our programmatic work is focused. And you can see essentially kind of how the major dollars flow here. So you'll see at the very top on the left-hand side, the green and blue, that represents, a lot of the tax dollars through personal income, meals and rooms, things like that. A lot of that money flows to public education. And then you'll see at the bottom of the left-hand federal dollars there, a lot of those dollars flow to healthcare. But again, wanted to just provide like a context of where natural resources sits within the state budget.
Great graphic.
Yes. Yeah, it's a good one. It's one of my favorites. Yeah, I use it quite often. So
It's beautiful.
So talking about our budget development cycle, I consider it a 12-month process with fluctuation. So there are times when our budget at the agency, all we're doing is budget development in one way or another. Other times it's not necessarily on the front burner, but it's always there. And when we come through and present a budget to all of you, what we're presenting there is the annual operating budget for the agency. It's also called the current service level budget. But there are also different budgets that we are managing in different ways. We have the capital bill, so the Department of Environmental Conservation, Fish and Wildlife, and Forest Parks and Recreation, they all receive capital bill dollars, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. There's also like the clean water budget ends up getting rolled into our annual operating budget, but there's a separate process there. So we're managing kind of these different timelines and tracks with these different budgets as we kind of roll everything up in terms of getting the work that we need to with these dollars. The Department of Finance and Management, that's the lead department in the executive branch for budget development. So when the agency is working on its budget, we flow information and requests through that department. The Department of Finance and Management also issues budget instructions, which I'll touch on in a couple slides, but those are really kind of the rule book for developing the budget. It tells us all the information that we need to kind of, get the budget ready for the governor's recommend. It has timelines and kind of the, what we should assume in terms of expenditures and general fund. And then, again, with the current service level budget, there's different ways to do budgeting. So you can do like a zero-based budget, which is kind of you start fresh every year. The model that the state uses is a current service level budget. So if our budget was $10 million last year, that's our starting place as we build the next year's budget. And so that's that's how we manage it on the state side in terms of developing those budgets. And then we're dealing with regular budget pressures. So for example, healthcare costs, things that are built into the collective bargaining agreement for state employees in terms of salary, those sorts of things that we know are going to be increasing. Those are built-in pressures that we have to manage before we decide to do anything else. So those are kind of the first step in the budget cycle, is understanding what those pressures are, those base pressures, and that gives us kind of a starting place. And then in our budget, general fund is an incredibly important piece, as it is for a lot of departments, but with our special and federal funds, they have very specific purposes usually. So those dollars can't be moved from one thing to another. So for example, if you have the game wardens, if they need extra or additional funding, we can't just grab that from any place. It usually has to come from general fund or some sort of state source. Federal funds and the special funds are restricted in a lot of ways.
Representative Pritchard.
Why wouldn't we use a zero-based budget? I mean, it makes no sense to me that we don't do that. It qualifies everything. And it makes you examine every program you have in place. And,
Yeah.
And to assume that, well, we're okay, so let's go forward from here. It's probably why we're in the mess that we're in. I think.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, or is that?
I understand where you're coming from. I mean, like I said, the Department of Finance and Management, they're the ones that set those instructions for us. I mean, so I think that, that question for that team is where that should be directed.
Have we ever zero-based budgeted?
I've been with the state since 2012. I've always done current service level budgets in that time.
I think the assumption that underlies that is we have so many statutory obligations that actually aren't discretionary. That doing a zero-based budget would sort of give a bit of a false sense of what we actually have. We, ANR, or even the executive branch have decision-making authority.
Wouldn't it allow you to separate statutory and have a true starting point? To me, I think that would.
Yeah, I mean, the 98% of what we do is probably driven by statutory obligations. I should take that back. That is somewhat of an exaggeration, but the things we do that aren't statutory obligations are largely education and outreach functions, supporting our statutory obligations.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I am curious about the history of this and like why, what would it be a lot of more work? Because it would really just be showing the whole picture, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the general premise with zero-based budgeting is like you're starting at zero, and basically like how I've seen it presented previously is like, okay, like these are the highest priorities, and you start basically building that budget until you hit whatever your cap is. So like if you're working in private business, right, you're like, we're projecting $10 million in revenues, we'll build our budget to $10 million, and basically from there, those other things, and you have questions around those. Versus with the current service level budget, we are assuming everything that we did last year as a base function is going to be in the next year's budget. So I would say it focuses on it emphasizes prioritization, the zero-based budgeting piece.
Sakowitz.
I would assume, tell me if I'm wrong, that would mean though that if a certain line item costs less one year than the previous year, I know they generally don't, but they certainly can, right? And if certain costs did go down, or if the requirement for a certain level of service changed in a way that costs less money, that would be reflected in the budget recommendation.
Yes, it would be captured in the budget recommendation. Yes, that's correct. All right, so I'm going to walk through a general timeline for how we develop budget at ANR. So this first snapshot is our initial development and submission. So usually this is on a July to October timeline. And at this point, the budget managers in the different department, we're collecting a lot of data. So we're going back and we're looking at previous year actuals over 3+ years and then budgeted it. And what we're trying to do there is align on the account code line item. So if you all look at like one of our budget books, it has like, for like line item for like envelopes and gasoline, and gets very granular. And so what we're doing at this stage is we're going through those individual lines and deciding, okay, based on actuals and based on what we know is needed for the upcoming year, where should these individual budget numbers land? And so that helps us to kind of address if there's a program, for example, if there's maybe savings somewhere, we would identify that. If there's a large increase, let's say that, gas prices, for example, using, different federal agencies, we can kind of look at a multi-year outlay. So that allows us to start piecing that together. At the same time, in August, we received budget instructions from the Department of Finance and Management. So that's our rule book. So that allows us to start to understand, when things are going to be due and kind of the percent general fund increase and those sorts of things. Also, there's this interesting piece where we are connecting with our policy teams at the agency and understanding if any policy proposals may have budgetary impacts. So again, trying to make sure that we incorporate those into any budget recommendation. And then where we end up in this first phase is in October, we submit our initial draft budget to the Department of Finance and Management. So that's really, I would say in terms of budget development, this first phase is probably is 60 to 70% of the work, because we're gathering everything and, basically consolidating and putting it into the formats for the governor's recommend. So I'll take a pause here and just talk about the budget instructions. So these are shared on the Joint Fiscal Office's website. And basically these are usually about 8 to 12 pages long, and they provide us with the blueprint for budget development. So it identifies what the general fund change will be for that individual year. So for example, for the FY27 budget, we had a 3% general fund increase was the amount identified. In previous years, sometimes that's flat. It has been, negative as part of the exercise. So there's different options there. Also, the annualized cost of salary changes, that gets incorporated into our budget build. So each year, with cost of living increases and steps, which are basically the increase in staff salaries, those get incorporated and captured as part of the budget development process. Also, the budget instructions, they'll identify holding places for benefit rate increases or internal service funds, which are the internal service fund is the amount of money we pay other departments for services. So while finance and management may not know the actual figure at this point, they'll tell us put a 10% placeholder in for health, put 8% for retirement, put 8% for internal services. So we walk through that exercise. Also in the budget instructions, they identify how we will present any restructuring or reduction options as part of our budget. So in a normal budget year, we usually get to a place where the expenditures are outpacing revenues in this initial submission that we make in October. And at that point, we have to identify any sort of, reduction options that may be available for the department to meet the budget target. At the same time, there are usually instructions in there that identify if we have any new initiatives. So this is something that goes outside of that current service level budget. So it may be a new program, it may be a new fee, depending on the year. It could be anything that's captured there. And then again, with the policies, ask for any policies with budgetary impacts, and then also provides us timelines for when we need to submit these different pieces of the budget. And that gets us to essentially that first phase where we submit the budget in October. And that's kind of I can't call it a draft, but it's that first budget submission. So
if I could add a little bit there, just generally what we've seen, as Steve indicated, is a 3% increase in our general fund allocation. He has slides on down the line that will show General fund is about a quarter of our overall budget. One of the agency's most significant challenges is that currently about half of our budget is federal funds. A lot of that's passed through grants and contracts, but we also receive sort of base federal allocations that support staff, notably in the Department of Environmental Conservation. And those federal dollars haven't increased in almost 20 years now. And so when we have 8% increases in health benefits or retirement, upward pressures on internal service funds, and then the pressures from the collective bargaining agreement and steps and COLAs. We're trying to cover all of that increase as much as possible on our limited pool of state dollars. And that is, our budget has a diversity of funding sources, and Steve's got a couple nice graphics about that. But one of the downsides is not all of them are sort of keeping pace with inflation.
Are any of them keeping pace with inflation?
I guess I defer to you, Stephen, what you think.
Um,
That is not really.
yeah, I mean, there's like some interesting. It's hard to answer that question, for example, because like with the wildlife restoration money that the Fish and Wildlife Department receives, if you were gonna ask that question from like last year to this year, the answer is probably no, but there are points in history where it has. So like as the federal, some of these federal funding sources have unique ways that they collect funding for it. And so there can be like these weird like multi-year blips where they do keep pace with inflation. So like, for example, the wildlife restoration dollars, I think it was maybe like 8 to 10 years ago, there was a period where it was keeping up. But at the moment, most of our federal funding sources, I would say, are not keeping up with the amount that the state budget is growing at ANR. So.
Representative Pritchard.
So the restoration, though, isn't it? A lot of that's Pittman Robertson, Dingle Johnson too, isn't it?
Yep, wildlife restorations is the Pittman Robertson piece. Yep.
So that's all based on what the sports folks
Exactly.
are spending.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's right. Like that's the unique thing about some of this is
Yeah.
we get these weird situations where you capture a period in time where there's a lot of activity happening that's generating money that's flowing to the federal program and it flows to the state.
Which
So
is solely funded by sports folks.
the wildlife restoration, yeah, there's a mix and match of recreational shooting and yes, hunting. Yep.
People purchasing guns.
Wildlife restoration.
Guns,
Whatever you-
ammo, lot of things.
Yep.
I guess I'm trying to understand. So the federal dollars, though, in this case, are they tied to our sort of base staffing levels, or are they in funds that could be like a restoration program can ebb and flow? You could use it for land conservation one year maybe, or not if it's not there. But if it's affecting our kind of base level of functioning is where it becomes an issue, and I'm hearing it is. So are
Yes.
we gonna kind of get to understanding that? Like,
We will.
Yeah, okay.
To the life of
Yeah,
the
I mean,
area.
we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's part of the set of decisions we make every year, and we put forward to the governor a set of proposals that are consistent with the direction we receive from government. So, and then the governor has the option to sort of buy back some of what the changes we propose to make to our budget. Generally, I would say our budget is growing between 5% and 8% a year with all of the upward pressures, and we receive 3% general fund. You're talking about the wildlife restoration money, but the
3% increase in general fund?
correct. But in DEC, about half of staff costs are covered with a performance partnership grant with the EPA that brings money in under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and Safe Drinking Water Act. That funding hasn't increased in almost 20 years. And so we struggle to keep up with that growth across the board. So generally, when we're sending forward our initial budget proposal, it includes reductions that we are proposing to make. And then the governor and his team review that in light of all the other budget proposals, and oftentimes we'll buy back some of the cuts we had proposed to close our budget gap.
So looking at the October to January snapshot, so at this stage, we have a meeting with the Department of Finance and Management. It's usually very similar to budget testimony. We walk through a presentation of what's included in our budget submission. They ask questions. It's kind of a exchange of information. Also during this time, departments are continually updating forecasts for both revenues and expenditures. So, you know, for example, there may be like a federal agency or a federal award where they'll be like, oh, it's going to change by, 5% this year. It's going to be a 5% increase. It's going to be a 3% decrease. So we're going back and forth and constantly adjusting numbers during this phase. Also, this is when we receive our finalized numbers for employee benefits and internal service funds. So this is things like the internal service fund are things like human resources and insurance costs. Also the Agency of Digital Services. So those numbers get finalized. In many instances, when those numbers are finalized, there's an additional general fund apportionment to cover those costs. So that may change, for example, this year there was the 3% general fund increase instruction, but for example, like FPR, the Forest Parks and Recreation, they had a 1.7% general fund increase. The reason it was less is because insurance costs went down. The general fund portion of those insurance costs were swept back. So they actually saw a smaller than 3% increase in general fund versus like the Department of Fish and Wildlife, it was, I think, 7.5% increase in general fund, because when we went through this stage of the budget and we started finalizing these numbers, there was additional general fund added to cover those costs. So the 3% is the starting place in that initial exercise. The second phase, things may shift from that 3% depending on the individual department. So, and then once we get through everything, we get to the governor's budget address. So at that point, the governor's recommend is finalized in January. Then we get to jump to the legislative process. So that's when we get to come through and do testimony in House and Senate appropriation committees, and then our policy committees of jurisdiction. So again, similar process where we come in, present our budgets, answer questions. At some point, the House Appropriations Committee takes the governor's recommend and the work that they've been doing. That gets converted into what's called the Big Bill, the Budget Act. And essentially that then is the conduit for all this information that gets carried through both chambers. Budget passes usually in May. And then on the agency and department side, once the budget's passed, we have to go back and reconcile what was passed versus what the governor's recommended budget was. Sometimes there's changes there. So we have to make sure that everything is trued up at that point. We go through and prepare division or program budgets. So this is, a finer level of detail so that individual directors and program managers can execute their budgets. So we finalize those, and then budget information is entered into Vision, which is the state's accounting system. And that allows us to basically get off and running on July 1st when the fiscal year starts. And when fiscal year starts, one's ending and we're planning for a third. So this is always an interesting time of year where we're doing 3 budgets at once, usually around July 1st. So any questions before I move away from the timeline piece?
It's going to be a quiz.
I hope not for all of your sake. It took me a while to learn all this. So this is just refreshing a couple of slides that we went through in our original budget testimony. So A&R's budget was just under $300 million this year. About 2/3 of that was with the Department of Environmental Conservation. And then you can see there's also on the low end, the 1%, that's A&R's pilot payment. So that's the payment we make to towns for lands that we own. Our budget is constructed, it's about half is going out the door through contracts, grants and loans. 1/3 of it's for salaries and benefits for our full-time workforce and our temporary staff. And then the rest of that, about 16% goes for all of our other operating. So that includes the internal service funds, it includes leases, for office space, pilot payment, vehicles, gasoline, office supplies, basically anything else that you can think of that you would need day to day to operate a 682 person organization. So.
Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do the pilot payments go up 3% every year, or the 3% strictly for operation?
So the pilot payments. So it's.
There is a separate piece of statute that governs pilot payments. It's a process we update once every 5 years. They're not growing at 3%. They're growing at the rate of, I think, increases in property valuation through a process we have established with the Joint Fiscal Office. So we've been applying a growth factor to our pilot payments annually. And I believe next year, we
Yes.
will be back in front of you all with the once every 5 year update to what that growth factor is that will apply for the next 5 years. I believe right now it's just shy of 2%. But it does grow every year.
Thank you.
Representative Austin.
Is part of the environmental conservation is current use in there?
Current use is forest parks and recreation. That's where that program lives. Yeah.
So is this for conserving land? I mean, I'm too literate.
Environmental conservation.
Yeah,
That's for the Department of Environmental Conservation as a whole. So there's a wide range of programs there, from air quality to drinking water capitalization projects. Yeah, so it's a large portfolio.
thank you.
Yep. And then this next slide, again, we provided this before, but this provides a snapshot over time of the different funding sources and the overall budget at ANR. Flagging at the very top, the dark green you'll see there, that's federal dollars that are coming through BIL, IIJA. So we saw the peak of those dollars in FY26. Those will eventually tether off and be back completely off of our budget, and we'll resume back to the pre 2023 kind of, budget funding sources there. So you'll just see that dark green bar at the top is a blip in history that will eventually fade away. In our budget, about 16% general fund, 30% special funds, and then 5% IDT fund, which is interdepartmental transfers. That's just us or somebody paying another place in state government. So it could be, one department paying another essentially. So those dollars have some other sort of backing, like they're either general funds, special, or federal funds, but they show up as IDT in all of our budget documentation. So. All right, I'm going to cover our major funding sources here and provide some background. So general fund at the agency in FY27, $48.7 million is what was in the governor's recommend. Looking at this from a programmatic perspective, what these dollars cover is a lot of the program work that happens within the secretary's office. Most of our pilot payment. Also, it covers administrative staff across the agency. So, whether that's business office staff or legal staff, those sorts of positions. Also, fish culture operations at Fish and Wildlife and game wardens have sizable general fund portions. The forestry division at FPR, and then the Office of Waters at DEC. So looking at it programmatically, those are some of the large investments of general fund dollars. And then looking at it from more of an accounting perspective, 2/3 of our general fund goes towards staffing costs, which are, again, highlighted in those programs I just covered. And then our next biggest category is internal service funds. So about 14% of our general fund goes to cover insurance, human resources, agency of digital services costs, those sorts of things. So just between staffing and internal service fund costs, it's about 80% of all of our general fund are dedicated just to those two places. Also, with general fund, it covers a lot of the legislative acts that are passed that work. So Flood Safety Act, the environmental justice work that our agency does, Climate Action Office, land use planning, Act 250, Section 248. A lot of those acts are covered with general fund dollars, so that's another part of that portfolio there. And then you'll see in the graph, what that shows is in the dark green, it shows the general fund amount, and then the total bar graph for each department shows their total budget. So you can see the general fund portion among the different departments is relatively equal. However, you can see, for example, like environmental conservation, that department has a very small percentage of general fund compared to its overall budget versus the secretary's office. It's a much larger percentage. So just wanted to provide that context also. Special and restricted funds. So we have over 30 different special and restricted funds, and these cover a wide range of things. It can be from the Fish and Wildlife Fund that collects hunting and fishing license fees, to permit fees collected for different programs. So there's a very wide range here. It's about $91 million of our budget is a special or restricted fund. Again, like these funds range from very small amounts of revenue in the thousands of dollars to tens of millions of dollars. So each special fund is pretty unique. Also, there's many times a very specific statutory purpose for these funds. So I provided an example of three of our special funds here. So the Environmental Contingency Fund, about $2.6 million budgeted in FY27. Those funds by statute can only be used for the investigation and mitigation of hazardous material releases to the environment. The Natural Resource Management Fund, that one's even a little bit more unique in the fact that there's the Secretary's Office, Forest Parks and Recreation, and then Department of Environmental Conservation, all operating pieces of that fund. So it includes Act 250 and Section 248 fee revenue. It includes motor fuel tax. It includes some grants that come in. And so right now that's budgeted at $810,000 in FY27. That one, the work is the expenditures are tied to the funding source. So like in the Secretary's Office, we collect the Act 250 and Section 248 fee revenue. That money then gets reapplied to our Office of Policy and Planning. So that's the team that does a lot of the Act 250 and Section 248 work. So we make sure that those revenues line with the expenditures of where the work's actually taking place. And then the last one is again a unique one. The Green Mountain Conservation Camp Endowment Fund. This is actually a registered 501c3. There's a board associated with it. They collect donations that then are used at our 2 conservation camp facilities in the state. So Buck Lake and then Kehoe. Thank you, man. Struggling. Kehoe. Those 2 facilities, so it can go for equipment or education programs, and there's $3,000 budgeted there. But again, wanted to just provide like a broad example of these different special funds and purposes and kind of the different dollar amounts. And, you know, for example, if we have like a budget problem in one area of the agency, this is when it starts getting complex to try to solve for, because when we go through these special funds, like none of these even though we may have money available, like some of these just may not be eligible for where that budget gap is. So we have to try to align where the budget gap is with the actual available revenues to fill that gap. And it's never a one-to-one for us, or very rarely a one-to-one for us. Next, federal funds. So this is in terms of funding source, the largest portion of our budget, just under $145 million budgeted in FY27. We have 37 different grants that were identified in FY27. Wanted to, again, just to provide some examples here. So I think it provides some clarity around the complexity here. So the Wildlife Restoration and Basic Hunter Education grant, that's Pittman Robertson, $5.2 million budgeted for that program. Those dollars can only be used for, if you're looking on the wildlife side, wild birds or mammals. So we're thinking it can't cover insects, it can't cover other species or genre of species there. It's just for those 2. It can also cover hunter education in a different sub account and also recreational shooting. Sport fish restoration, $4.2 million budgeted. Again, the purpose there is there's a couple, but essentially the restoration and conservation and management of sport fish species and populations. And then it also allows a separate sub-account for boat access to public water. So our fishing access area program, a large portion of that money comes from this federal pot. And then there's also a matching state portion through the motorboat registration dollars. So that's how that program's funding stack is developed. Next, the drinking water state capitalization grant program, just over $14 million budgeted. And this is focused on low cost, long-term drinking water infrastructure around capitalization grants. And then the last one before I take a pause, brownfield response program, almost $1.5 million budgeted. And this is looking at setting up standards and policy for site cleanups and then approving site cleanup plans and those sorts of decisions. So again, the dollars tied to those federal funding sources can't just be moved and used for any sort of budget gap. They have to meet the criteria and the eligibility. So again, same with the special funds, but when we take those special and federal funds, we have about $230 million out of $300 million that are usually tied to very specific purposes within the agency's mission.
But these federal funds are the ones that haven't increased in 20 years.
I mean, most of them, that's a,
There's a mix there.
yeah, there's like, for example, like wildlife restoration, I think, don't hold me to this, but I think when I started with the department, that was around $3 million in 2012. It went up to like $7 million at its peak, and now it's around $5 million. So that has increased in the last 20 years. It's less than it was 4 or 5 years ago, but it is still more than it was 10 or 15. And I think the programs you were talking around were the DEC.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you want to flip back to that stacked chart.
Yeah. Yeah, this one?
No, the line graph.
Yep.
That
this
one.
Yeah.
So reflected in that 144 million is both the sort of blue bar, which is our base federal funds, and that dark green wedge at the top of this graph, which is the one, well, it's more than one-time money. It's the 5-year program money we're seeing under the or bipartisan infrastructure law, excuse me. So it's a little bit of a mix. If you look at that blue bar in the middle, though, you can see it really doesn't change very dramatically over time. Our green bar, our special funds bar grew much more significantly. Our general fund bar has also grown as a percentage more significantly, but the federal funds, that blue wedge, has been fairly consistent with the changes really coming in the Fish and Wildlife and Forest and Parks account as opposed to the DEC account. I think the other thing that's probably important to mention is we often are using those general funds and special funds to meet match requirements for federal funds. They vary from program to program. In Fish and Wildlife, it's one state dollar and we're able to pull down 4 federal dollars. When the drinking water capitalization grants, I think it's one state dollar pulls down 3 federal dollars, and there are other places with lower ratios. But so we're also always trying to make sure we have the right amount of non-federal dollars that we can point to as match for those federal funding sources.
And have we left any money on the table that we didn't match?
Federal dollars? I
Not
don't
to
think,
my knowledge.
no.
We work really hard to do that. We also sometimes will actually allow in the clean water space, the Lake Champlain Basin program, to point to some of our clean water dollars because they also need to prove match in order to access federal funding that then ultimately comes to us. But so we're sort of providing a 2-step match process to help ensure the Lake Champlain Basin program also pulls down the $30 or so million of federal funding they have available to them that supports our work.
Yeah, and I think that's like when we're in the budget development process, one of the considerations is with these federal dollars. So if we're looking at a program and it's, we save one state dollar, but then we have to cut 3 federal dollars. So essentially you lose 4 program dollars, right? Like that's a hard justification. And if you can go find somewhere that there's maybe a 1-to-1 reduction. So that is part of the, discussion that we have when internally, and then when we work with the Department of Finance and Management of like, these are options, but again, like you're could have a 4-fold impact in terms of making that same cut. So that is part of the calculus with developing the budget.
Madam Morse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at the Brownfield Response Program, and I realize this is federal funding. And I realize cleanup, site cleanup, reuse decisions and standard. I realize that's a lot of money. We can't fund that every year to its full extent. I understand that. But where does the Brownfield Assessment Fund come from that our RPCs are using to identify where sites are?
That is also federal money. Generally, the RPCs are making direct applications to EPA for those funds, and that comes on top of what EPA supports our own internal response program with. So we're sort of the technical capacity to help with that work, and then they provide additional financial assistance directly to RPCs to conduct those assessments.
Your graph then doesn't show those monies. That's
Does not.
separate.
Correct.
That's good to know.
That reminds me of the word grant in this context. Are they like competitive grants that you have to apply for annually and then manage as a grant? Or is it more like granted to us?
A little column A, a little column B. EPA money that goes into DEC comes under the umbrella of something called a Performance Partnership Agreement. So it's a recognition that EPA has delegated a bunch of responsibilities to the Agency of Natural Resources under Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act. We sit down annually and talk to them about what effectively we can afford to do with the dollars they're providing. It's a negotiation and a back and forth, but then as long as we're keeping up with the commitments we've made, they continue to provide those dollars. Perhaps the best example of a competitive grant is a lot of the U.S. Forest Service grants, and recognizing FPR is in a different part of this building, but it's within our agency. They are applying for competitive grants through the U.S. Forest Service, and more recently the Northern Borders Regional Commission that helps support various facets of their work. And in those instances, we are acting just like any grant recipient of our dollars would, where we are committing to a set of deliverables and then providing proof and seeking reimbursement for work we're performing under the terms of the grant.
And are you involved in all of that? Like, how does that even logistically work? All of that, like you're negotiating with EPA, that just is like.
So it's different teams within the agency, depending on what funder we are working with, what projects we are proposing to do. We do, for each department in the secretary's office, prepare an audited overhead rate. So how much staff time does it take to do this work, which factors into each one of those grants. So unlike if you were hiring a consultant where you might negotiate over rates in addition to the scope of work, we're really just talking about the scope of work, what we can afford to do for the funding that's being offered to us. So it's a little bit different than a private sector negotiation. But yeah, we spend a significant amount of time, I would say, in that contract and oversight. Steve and I were talking about it on the way down, and our best estimate is somewhere, the agency has 682 full-time equivalents, about 50, and maybe even a little bit north of that, of those folks are in one of the business offices, either in the 3 departments or in the secretary's office. So we have upwards of 8% of our staff are really just managing, I would say, grants in, grants out, accounts payable, sort of the money side of what we're doing.
Yeah.
All right. Wanted to provide a snapshot of the capital budget. This probably doesn't flow through this committee very often, but it is a a significant part of A&R's portfolio. So in the capital bill, we have two sections that we usually have funding identified in. The first is section 9, which is specifically for our agency. And this provides this can change. The capital bill's on a 2-year cycle. So it's a changing target depending on the types of projects, but basically we have matching dollars tied for EPA water infrastructure grants, usually money tied and associated with dam safety. State parks is the biggest user of capital dollars, so that's in that third line there, park infrastructure. And then the public lands and access infrastructure line, that covers basically all non-state park type recreational lands that FPR owns. And then for fish and wildlife, the major maintenance, that covers fish culture operating stations. It covers fishing access areas, wildlife management areas, things like parking lots, roads, those sorts of things. And then occasionally there's a smaller amount. Lake Champlain Walleye Association gets a pass-through of capital dollars for managing walleye rearing ponds that at one of their facilities. So that's a general normal request for the agency. Also in section 10, there's clean water funding there. So that entire section 10 appropriation is usually about $10 million annually. We at A&R in the FY26 budget, we had $4 million for municipal pollution control grants, and then $200,000 for forestry roads and water quality improvements. The Agency of Ag also receives some of those clean water dollars, and also VHCB is the other recipient in FY26.
The only other thing I'd point out there is just that the agency owns and stewards about $1 billion worth of assets statewide. We own 80 dams, including the 3 major flood control facilities at Wrightsville, Eastbury, and Waterbury. The 55 state parks, 200 fishing access areas, 600 miles of roads, and then 370,000 acres of land. And so one of our efforts underway is to develop an asset management system to help us better ensure we are making the highest priority investments of the limited capital dollars we see. We're either second or third in terms of the value of the property we own, with VTrans and BGS being the top 2. And I believe we own more land, where we are the largest landowner within state government. So it is a really significant set of assets that this agency stewards on behalf of Vermonters.
It is, and we appreciate it.
Question on this slide too.
Representative Morris.
It's a quick one. We've had a lot of conversation in this committee about the 3 acres rule. You got a line item on your park infrastructure, which I think you kind of alluded to a little bit, an explanation. Is this all staffing, or is this actual maintenance,
Projects.
infrastructure upgrades?
Is projects.
Projects?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, our staff at the park system is generally paid for out of the park special fund, which is where we deposit all of the gate revenues as well as our ski area lease payments. Because there are 8 ski areas
7 or 8 out of
Yeah. That lease state-owned lands as part of their ski operation. And we receive annual compensation from them for those leases that is also deposited into that fund. Just in terms of the 3-acre rule compliance, there are 13 of our 55 state parks that trigger the 3-acre rule, and so are subject to the same regulatory
Oh, so
requirements.
this is our own 3-acre compliance.
Correct.
Yeah, it's 3-acre compliance at state parks. Yeah.
So each lane has to have a little retention pond.
I think generally what they have been pursuing is either removing impervious surface or treating road runoff through the park facilities.
All right. this I'll run through pretty quickly, but just wanted to provide some examples of how behind the scenes these dollars are managed. So in terms of tracking spending, we have what's called the chart of accounts for the entire state that we utilize. This helps us basically identify the funding source, which division, department, program those dollars are being spent from, if there's federal funding tied to it, and if so, like which federal grant. So we have this established so that we can track all this money in terms of where it's being deployed and then able to reconcile to federal boards or other audits. Budget reports, so we're providing divisions and/or programs with regular budget reports so they're able to track their spending. So that's something that the budget managers in each of the individual departments are working on. So this helps reconcile what was passed by the legislature in terms of the budget, what's actually being spent, and making sure that we are on a proper course in terms of spending those dollars and not overspending through the fiscal year. Also, there are a series of internal controls established. So we have an annual internal assessment that we do that the state manages. So this is usually somewhere between 80 to 150 questions that we go through, answer. And this is kind of our opportunity to identify if there's internal control deficiencies within our agencies or departments so that we can correct those. Also, the agency is subject to a wide variety of audits. These can come from our federal funders like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or EPA. Also, the state has a contract with a third party to do audits on departments and agencies. And then there's also the state auditor that we have audits done that are completed through our agency on occasion. So variety of different auditing methodologies. And then in terms of compliance, there are a whole range of different rules and procedures that we have to follow. I'm highlighting some of the larger ones here. Bulletin 3.5, so that's for contracting and procurement. Those are all the rules in terms of, you know, I want to buy a piece of software for $10,000. Like, how do I do it? Tells you the number of bids you have to get, like how that has to work, who has to sign off on it for approval. Includes, I think it's almost a 200-page document. It has everything you could imagine around trying to buy something. And then Bulletin 5, that's for subgrants. So when we're passing money through a subgrant process, that has a different set of rules, and that's captured in Bulletin 5. And then there are a series of policies that the Department of Finance and Management manages. So this includes things like payment terms. So for example, the normal payment term for the state of Vermont is 30 days. So when a supplier submits an invoice to the office, they will get paid in 30 days. There are exceptions to that, you know, sometimes for grants or maybe smaller entities that are working on a very tight cash flow. So that provides the payment terms of if you want to change that 30-day number to 10, 20, something like that, how you go about doing that. There's a range of policies and procedures for pretty much everything you could think of in terms of around accounts payable, contractings and grants, and that's where those live. So wanted to just flag that because that's something that happens behind the scenes, but does kind of roll up into the piece that the secretary was mentioning around the staff that we have in the business offices to make sure these dollars are deployed. You know, part of that is making sure we are in compliance and that those dollars are being spent correctly. And then last, I wanted to just provide a intro for the two presentations that are scheduled in this committee tomorrow. So we have identified a couple of different divisions to come in that provide a contrast in terms of different division budgets at the agency. The first is the Water Investment Division. This is in DEC. Their budget's about $114 million, which is about 38% of the entire agency's budget. And you'll see in that breakdown below, 92% of that is contracts, grants, and loans. So for that division, right, they have a large focus on moving money out the door to other entities. Also, they have a complex funding stacks, federal funds and other funds tied in there. It's a glorious little chaotic funding stack there. And then the second one to provide that contrast is the Warden Services Division at Fish and Wildlife. So there you'll notice that the budget is predominantly salary and benefits, 87% of that. So that kind of provides that contrast of what a budget that looks like that's heavily personal services versus money going out the door looks like. And also with the Warden Service Division, it's mostly state dollars. It's general fund, Fish and Wildlife Fund, which is hunting and fishing license fees. I think there's like $25,000 of federal funds in their budget out of the $8.6 million, if I remember correctly, that comes from the Pittman-Robertson federal funding source. But essentially it's a state funded budget. So that will help you kind of, I think reconcile with some of the slides I presented previously around how each of those dollars has like a different eligibility criteria and how that kind of shows up in individual divisions. So.
Representative North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to be really interested to find out within the DEC budget, given all of the flow through money that occurs there, who that all flows out to. Those. Other. They subcontract and then subcontract again. How far does that money flow and how much of it gets peeled off for administration each time?
Yeah, I mean, Steve, if you want to flip back to your pie chart.
Yeah.
Because on that slide, there's some statistics about, at least the first question you asked Representative North in terms of, how those dollars go out, right? Where, obviously those numbers at the bottom there total up to more than the 114 million that's in it, but the water investment division is the lion's share of those. And I suspect, they are disproportionately responsible for loans, but then have a large role in grants and contracts. Generally, there are restrictions placed on how much overhead someone can charge back to the state, either an audited rate or in some instances, it's a fixed or a capped amount, depending on how the program was established, either in statute or rule. But that program, those folks will be in a great position to talk to you about their specific programs.
There, in addition to money flowing to and through A&R, are there other maybe directly contractors or directly agreed agencies, quasi-governmental agencies that receive money for conservation type things?
So the Lake Champlain Basin program, which only works in the Lake Champlain Basin, so about half of Vermont, receives federal funding for a lot of work that is similar to work we are doing at A&R. If it's identical, they oftentimes will actually just send the money to us to administer as opposed to creating a redundant grant or contract opportunity. But they see about $30 million a year. Roughly 18 million of that comes to Vermont and the balance goes to New York and Quebec. So that may be the largest federal funder explicitly in our space. Another really important partner though in conservation work is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They provide cost share for a lot of agricultural practices, as you might imagine, but in our space, a lot of private forest land stewardship work is also funded through cost share and incentives offered through NRCS. They have a state technical committee that meets at least quarterly and may meet more frequently, but allows us as well as folks like conservation districts and other partners that help encourage landowner participation in those programs to make sure that we're coordinated, that we are providing sort of a single set of messages to landowners about what those opportunities look like, and that there's ideally we're working from a shared set of priorities. But I would say those are probably the two biggest funders. There are other organizations out there. Northern Borders Regional Commission is another one that provides may provide direct grants to communities or other eligible organizations for specific projects, but those tend to be more one-off as opposed to the Basin Program funds and the NRCS funds, which are pretty generally available year to year.
From the federal government. Yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of get a whole picture of all of that conservation work that's being done and where all that funding is coming from, because clearly it's not all within your pocket.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And VHCB plays an important role in that space too, and has access to other federal funding programs that we don't, as well as the Agency of Agriculture.
So where would one go to kind of get that big picture of that? I mean, I know you're not responsible for it, so I don't ask you to do that, but is there a place where we can kind of get that big picture?
I don't know. I mean, some of it may be in the Act 59 report that is being worked on as we speak. Obviously, that was intended to be a comprehensive look at conservation in Vermont. Haven't seen sort of what the working draft of the report will deliver to this body over the summer looks like yet to know if it's in there. But the first piece of that was to figure out the conserved lands inventory. And so it would seemingly make sense that we'd also be looking at those sources of state, federal, and philanthropic funding that is available to support conservation work. But
That's very much act with land focused. I think you're
Yes.
talking about everything.
Oh, yeah.
Water and
All the, yeah.
oh, I don't know that exists.
Yeah, I realize it's a scope.
Correct, and it's almost like a set of Venn diagrams, right? Where I'm aware of where the work of ANR, for example, overlaps with the work of the Agency of Agriculture, and sort of the places where there's shared funding sources that can hopefully address goals of both agencies. But then ag would have access to money for rangeland or grazing programs. That doesn't really intersect with ANR's interests very much. So I don't have the same sense for those programs as I would for some of their agronomic practices and general farmland conservation practices.
comments, questions?
Breakdown.
No. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much.
Very user friendly. Thank you.
To say, please don't hesitate to ask if you have questions, particularly after you have the benefit of the two presentations Steve teed up for tomorrow, which hopefully give just a kind of that next level drop down. It didn't seem possible to do all of the agency's divisions, and certainly not the programs that sit under those divisions. But if there are other areas of particular interest, please let us know. Those were the two that sort of came to front of mind for me, because they are kind of the extreme ends of the warden service that's almost exclusively general funds, and then the water investment division that is nearly fully pass-through funds, grants and contracts and loans.
Representative Norris.
Just one other quick question, that when do we expect to be past or beyond that VIL ARPA curve? When are we gonna get back to
Normal.
normal, whatever you want to call it?
I think we have one more year after, so the federal fiscal year and the state fiscal year don't line up, right? We start July 1st, they start October 1st, so there's a little bit of out of sync. I think we have one more full year, and we may actually have that 3-month piece on the other end, so there'll be a tail. But as that graph showed, we have certainly peaked and are on the back end of that. That said, a portion of those federal funds that came to us under the bipartisan infrastructure law have gone out as loans, and so they will be paid back over time. The team tomorrow can talk to you a little bit about the state revolving fund. That's not just it truly does revolve, right? Where we are capitalizing new loans, making those loans. We charge modest interest rates to municipalities. But those loans are paid back over time and allow us to push new loans out. So there's both the capitalization grant each year, where we're getting new federal money matched with capital fund dollars, as Steve spoke to, but there's also loan repayment money. And it's that both of those numbers taken together that allow us to see how much loan we have, or how much we have available to loan in the coming year.
Any idea how much of all that ARPA bill money actually,
We'll get-
that kind of a program where it's.
Will get revolved. I want to say it's about half.
Wow.
So there were absolutely components of it where the intent was to incentivize some certain types of investments. And so the way to incentivize it is to make the money really appealing by either increasing the amount of what we call subsidy, which is how much of that loan you don't actually have to pay back, or turning it into a direct grant. So for things like emerging contaminants, lead service line replacement, at least half of the dollars we received are going to not need to be paid back. There are other parts of that funding where it was just supplemental clean water and drinking water loans. So just doing more of what we're already doing in terms of reinvesting in our municipal drinking water and wastewater systems. They received maybe a more favorable set of terms. But in general, those need to be paid back. But the staff tomorrow will be able to talk about that in a bit more detail.
Thank you again. It's really.
Great programs, by the way.
Mm.
We have way more demand than we have dollars.
A lot
in
of the
those programs
programs.
because it is such an affordable. And unlike, there's a lot of places where people don't want a long-term loan, right? Like they're accruing interest. The loans through the state revolving fund tend to be low cost, and municipalities ideally are never going out of business. And so our ability to offer longer term, like 30-year loans, is also helps with some of the affordability challenges in keeping up those systems.
Absolutely.
That ongoing bump is pretty intriguing. So maybe we'll learn about that.
Yeah, you will. I mean, most of that bump is being managed through the Water Investment Division.
Okay, great. Okay, so
Some people are still willing to bring up brownfields.
We have the right audience.
we are meeting at 8:30 tomorrow morning to look at H727, just
Thank you.
schedule change. Half hour early so that we can walk through the changes that they made at our recommendation and straw poll on. And I would ask members to think about, we're gonna hear from Jared Carpenter, who we didn't get to hear from today on the chloride bill. A lot of testimony on this last year. The bill hasn't changed significantly. But I'd like you to think about questions you have and if there's anyone you need to hear from on it. And so with that, we're back on tomorrow morning and we'll see you then.